WWDC 2023 came and went, and I want to now give you a short recap of my highlights and the SwiftUI updates that I think are very important and worth talking about. I'm not going to go through everything that was talked about in WWDC, simply because it's not enough time for me to go through everything. Before I dive into the details, I want to give a short recommendation for developers who are just starting out with the Apple platforms. Usually you really don't need to jump on the new APIs that are released during WWDC. This is because they are mostly beta, so very early right now, with a lot of bugs. And if you're just beginning, it's really difficult to know if it's a bug or if it's meant like this. Or there's bugs with the previews for some of these APIs or the simulators. And just wait a couple of weeks until at least the beta 4, where it's more stable and they fixed most of the big issues. The main thing with these new APIs is that lots of apps won't be able to use them for apps in production, won't be able to actually use them for another 2 years, which is maybe why I'm not super motivated anymore for WWDC, because you see all these new cool features and APIs, but if you can't use them, it's annoying. But one thing that I really want to talk about is how SwiftUI was evolving over the last 4 years. It was released in 2019, and there was still quite a lot of ups and downs and new things and deprecated APIs. Last year in 2022, we had a complete overhaul of the navigation API, which was necessary, but you don't want to deal with major updates after a couple of years when you already used it. And the navigation definitely needs to be good enough. I already went through some of the documentation to check if something deprecated, and I didn't see anything. So this is good news. Mostly we have newer APIs, newer features, small additions, which means that it's more stable now. And additionally, they put more effort into optimizing for performance. There was quite a bit of discussion around this topic. So how to test and how to write code that is better for performance. And one of them is the add observable. This is in addition to the observable protocol and the existing property wrappers. It's not necessary that you need to rewrite your whole app for using this. You can still use the old one. And in most cases, you will be completely fine. The main difference for this is that it has a better performance, because if you previously used a view model, a observable object, and then use the add state object property wrappers, they update all their views that use this view model. And in some cases, you only changed one property in the view model, in the observable object, but all the views, even though nothing changed for them, the properties they use didn't change, but they still get updated. So you have a lot more redrawing than necessary. With the new add observed, they said they made sure that only the views that really need this one property of this model, only they are updated. This means if you have an app that doesn't have any issues with performance, you don't need to worry about this. If you have problems, especially if your app's growing, you add more features, and you do a lot of more calculations, then this is a huge update. For me, the one use case that I have is for a app state model or a navigation state manager. If you saw some of my navigation tutorials, how to do state-driven navigation, then this will be very useful, because I have one model, the app state or navigation state manager, that I use for all of my application to collect all these states from the navigation, like presentations. If I have a navigation split view, which detail is shown, what view is on the navigation stacks, do I show a sheet? All of these different configurations is collected. I usually collect in there, because then I can easily navigate back and forth, also programmatically navigating very easily from within tab views. But because I am navigating through different areas of my app, this view model is used, this model is used everywhere in my app, which means if I update one property, everything changes, everything has to update. In some cases, this is a problem. And for me, add observable would help a lot. I'm going to probably do a complete walkthrough where I can really show you the advantages of this. In addition to this add observed, they also said they made improvements to performance for table and lists with a lot of data inside. I hope this also works for macOS lists, tables, because I had some issues there. I'm not the only one who had issues with this one. So let's hope it's at least usable enough. The way I see SwiftUI in comparison to UIKit, most apps will have to use some form of UIKit components where it's just not good enough. The typical one is the text field, which doesn't give you a lot of control over the editing. So you usually have to drop down to UI text view. Right now, I don't really think only SwiftUI is going to be the future. So it's not a SwiftUI or UIKit. It's, okay, you can still use only UIKit, which will slow you down quite a bit in comparison to SwiftUI. If you will probably always have to use both, which is not the best news for new developers, because then you need to learn both. But especially for UIKit, you don't need to learn everything. You don't need to learn about storyboards or that much about view controllers. I think it's more like the components that are interesting. Now I will do the fun part where I will go through some of the SwiftUI features and I show you what things you can now implement. And a lot of this is just additional. For example, more control over MapKit, in-app purchases, so you don't need to build the screens yourself, interactive charts, a lot more about watchOS. I don't really have a Apple Watch, so I never understand the whole point of this, but maybe one day. Previews is quite a nice thing, because now you can actually use not only SwiftUI views for previews, but directly UIKit. For example, I can just here preview a view controller, or I could also use a UI view. It's the same as for NS View and NS View controller. This is nice. I guess most people already added some wrappers to do this, but now you are getting this per default. The other thing they changed with the preview is that you can now separate from your run target. So I have here the iPad selected as the target, but in the preview it's different. You can also keep the automatic one, then it always uses the target that you selected. So now it switches to the iPad. This is great because I used to always have to switch back and forth. Otherwise, this time it stayed pretty much the same. Then we have SwiftData. This is another wrapper for core data to easier work in SwiftUI. I didn't really look into this API. It looks very promising, but there is a couple of questions I need to see in the upcoming weeks, like how the performance is, how much you can actually do with it. If, for example, one thing that is probably missing is that you cannot dynamically change the predicate, and I need to also see how it works with UIKit. Because as I said, you always have to work with UIKit at some point. It would be a shame if this is the reason why I can't use it. Then we have now the inspector. This is more interesting on macOS. It is on the trailing edge, you can have another area. So in this case, I have a navigation split view, usually with a root view and a detail. And I also added an inspector. This is outside, which is then here this yellow area. Mostly would just show some details like editing choices. If you have a drawing app, you could show all the options for changing the line color, text fonts, and so on. On the iPad, this will, in large screen, as you see, it's an extra column. This is also on macOS. For the iPhone, this will be a sheet. So here I have a navigation stack. And inside, I again use an inspector. The same presentation, the tens and interaction work because it's just a sheet. So you can make this big. This is then the same view we used as an additional information sheet. I think this is a great addition, especially for macOS. This was missing. It's actually strange that it took them so long. Most apps have some kind of inspector or sidebar. I mean, Xcode also has this area. So this is the inspector area, so to say. I didn't test it on macOS because I didn't want to install the beta yet. Don't do that. Too early. It's never too good to be a beta tester. Then there's some cool stuff for tables and lists. So you can now programmatically expand and collapse a list. So you can set the initial value as expanded or as collapsed. You see I used two different ones. It works the same. And now I added here a button where I programmatically collapse and expand this section. Then for the table, this is one thing that doesn't work properly in the preview. Also not for Yeah, for the iPad it doesn't work, so I need to run this. One thing you can do now is add disclosure groups in tables. So here you can show and hide more items underneath. On macOS, or at least I think it only works on macOS, you can also reorder these columns or completely close one of these columns. And you can also on macOS hide the header and change also the background colors. Because on macOS it's usually alternating backgrounds. So each second line is grayed out. Then we have TipKit, which is a really nice feature where you can just show hints on certain areas of the views. And you can also decide on how often this is shown. Most web apps, I think, have this now. You can see, oh yeah, you can do this here. Just go for the walkthrough. Unfortunately, it's not available with the first beta. We'll see when I can actually test TipKit. Then there is a lot of new interaction things, especially for ScrollView. Looking at the example from the presentation, you can now use paging or view paste. They actually used here the scroll target behavior of view aligned, so it always snaps into each of these views. You can also use the container relative frame to decide how large the cells are, and in this case they decide to use each of these cards is 2/5 of the available space. So here you see this image and you divide the whole available width here by 5, and each of the cells takes up 2 of these. So this cell is 2/5, which means that this behavior I previously had to do with Geometry Reader, and if I can avoid using Geometry Reader, I definitely will. The code is much shorter. And this kind of behavior is very common in a lot of apps, like they also use in the App Store, where you have a lot of different sections. And some of the sections are horizontal scrolling. So at this section, I'm using a lazy H grid. And first of all, I want to show here this section, this column in a certain width of the available width. And I want to have this view-based snapping paging behavior. It doesn't work perfectly on the preview, but you see it does snap in if you try it on the simulator. The container relative frame also allows you to calculate something. So if you use the one where you get the length in the axis, I can say I want to change this in the horizontal axis. And in this case, if the width is smaller than 500 pixels, then I just use 90% of the available width. So this is why you see it's 1 and a little bit of this next column. And otherwise I use half. For example, if I have the iPad, in this case, when I say half, it uses 2 columns and then a little bit. Otherwise, if I don't do this, it would be like down here where I stretches the full width. This new container relative frame seems to be super flexible and helpful for adjusting to screen sizes. And together here with the scroll target layout and scroll target behavior, I can do quite a lot of advanced things. You can also now do some animations during scrolling. This is the second example from the presentation, where they scale and change the opacity during scrolling. So you see when they're in the center, they are just identity. They have one scale and opacity of one. Otherwise, they're smaller and they're opaque. That's why they come in opaque. So definitely, I'm very excited about the ScrollView updates. Then the other theme is how to optimize your views for the screen that you have. For example, if you have a very long menu, this might take up a lot of space. And the second part here, this is a picker where I want to choose for a certain color. And with menus, you can change the color, which is annoying. Now they introduced a control group style of compact menu. So now you see here my first few menu items are in a horizontal stack with only the icon. And for the color picker here, I used a picker style of palette. And when one of the options is selected, it's filling this one. That's why when you change here, the icon is filled. And also with this, you can actually use the tint. So this is a very nice feature. And I saw this in quite a few of the system apps for iOS 16. And I was always wondering how they did it. And then now they finally allowed us to do the same. As a comparison, when you use just the picker, you get here, and I can use a picker menu style. Again, I don't have these colors. But you can also just put a picker inside a menu. Again, use the palette style. I know it's a lot of put it here and put it there combinations. And then you only get these views. If you add 6 options, more than 6 options, it actually on iOS puts it in horizontal scroll view. So it doesn't get too big. They also adjusted for this. Very nice addition. You can now also do more for the border style of buttons. We had quite a bit of an update for button styles, for example, here bordered prominent styles or just bordered styles. But what you couldn't do before was, for example, change this shape to a circle. And now I can simply set the button border shape to a circle. This is just a little bit addition, but some people are annoyed by just rectangular buttons. Then there's a bit of hover effect. This is more for tvOS. And something I thought was quite interesting is for keyboard shortcuts. So usually when you do keyboard shortcuts, you can add a keyboard shortcut modifier to, for example, a button. In this case, I said the keyboard shortcut is Command K. When I press this, the button action will be executed. So I always have to attach the keyboard shortcut modifier to a control view to the button. And now we have the onKeyPress modifier. This is called when this view that I attach this to is in focus, or any views inside are in focus or first responder. This is a little bit hard to explain if you didn't hear about the responder chain before. But basically it means that something here is the user interacts with something. Now I can type normally in my text field, and what this onKeyPress does is in the responder chain system, when I type here, when I interact with my keyboard, it first calls this closure. You can say if you want to interact here for letters or numbers, or if you want doing which phase, so when I press down. And then in the closure you get the press configuration state, so you do get the phase, and if you press command or if a letter is it or character. And you need to return a key press result. It's either handled or ignored. If you say ignored, it basically means I didn't do anything here, just ignore me, and pass it down the responder chain. So pass it down to any view that would accept this keyboard input. And the other case is handled. If you say handled, it means I did something for this keyboard shortcut and don't pass it down. This example, I said if I type K, then you just ignore what I did, and otherwise just continue. Actually not. If I maybe it's just me or the naming is weird. So if I press K, I handled this, which means that the text field here will never get a K. So I can now type here and then press K, and it never does it. Okay, and you need to trust me now. In this case, I'm rather limiting what goes into the text field. So you could filter the input types. Maybe on macOS you have something. This might not be the intended use case, but maybe it helps in doing some editing for a text field. But the nice thing is now I don't need to have here a button where this action is performed. I cannot just do this. For example, in this field, maybe I don't have a button, but I still want to add a keyboard shortcut. I can do this now. Okay, you can always add this to the menu, but I think this is just a little bit more convenient in some cases. We'll see if I can find some good use cases for the onKeyPress. Then they put a lot of effort into animations. Now, the tools you have for animations is quite a lot. And the big ones are the keyframe animator and the face animator. These are in contrast to existing ones. Existing animation works are interruptible. So when the user presses a button, you want to change the state. Maybe you have a toggle and you want to do a nice animations of a favorite button, favorite toggle with a nice animation of this from one state to the other. And you can, with the existing animation API, you can make this interruptible. So halfway through the animation, you can go back. Whereas the keyframe animator and the face animator, you can't do that. It always runs the whole animation. Keyframe animations are interesting, for example, for onboarding flows where you want to show a nice animation of what your app can do. So you say, this view goes there, this button goes there, this circle, things are moving around. This is the example they had, and you can fine tune in saying, okay, in the first quarter of a second, I'm going to do my vertical translation by 30, so it moves down 30. Then in the next 0.3 second, I'm moving 120 pixels up. Then for the next one, more up. And you can really fine-tune each of these parameters individually. So the translation, how it moves, can be independent of how it scales. So it gets bigger and larger, or how it rotates. I'm guessing this is a great new thing for designers, because now they can do all of these advanced things. If you are an indie developer, you might not care so much about this, or at least not to the extent. The simpler version, this is a very advanced keyframe animator tool. The one step simpler is actually this face animator. Instead of individually animating all these properties, the scale and the rotation and the translation, you can define phases. So here they defined 4 phases. Let's maybe just play this first. So it goes smaller, then it rotates. We have these distinct phases. Then you can use the phase animator, and it will automatically go through each of these phases. And one part is how, for each of the phases, how does you view your content? In this case, the happy dog image. How does it change? So for each of these phases, how does the rotation changes? This is calculated here. So in this phases rotate by 360 degrees. In this phase, the other ones don't do anything. Or in the first phase, scale to 1, then shrink down, go up a little bit, and then go back to the normal size. And then for the other part is, for each of these phases, you need to decide how long it takes and the animation behavior. So do you want to have a spring animation, or linear, or more bouncy? This is probably the easier way of doing all these animations, and probably for non-designers enough. They also talked a little bit about visual effects. So here you see they're moving around. I don't really think this is more maybe for background animations, a little bit of fine-tuning. You can now also use metal shaders. So here this text design is now possible. And maybe the cool thing is the symbol animations. Most of these animations are probably, you shouldn't use too much, just a little bit. I find using animation is always a little bit tricky, because you easily overdo it, especially with so many tools now available. If you have an indie app, or you want to publish an app for your first time, you probably don't need to look at these too much. macOS has new interesting things. So there was the inspector. So this is the additional sidebar. But you can also use a settings link. This will allow you to programmatically open the settings window. Sounds quite useful in some cases. You can use the dialog suppression toggle. For example, here I have alert or an action sheet. This is usually for something like a delete alert. Are you sure you want to delete this file? Where you say, yes, I want to delete, or cancel, don't delete. And now you can say, don't ask me this again. I'm sure I can handle, I don't want to see this alert all the time. I directly want to delete. So you can use this, and it will actually persist it for next time, so it won't show again. You can also change the icon in this alerts or sheets. And up here on the right, this question mark, this is actually the settings link to open settings window. It feels more like they're filling in smaller gaps of features that developers were requesting and most apps need. But I feel it's definitely an improvement, and I'm looking forward to actually use some of this. The last topic that I felt was a little bit coming short was the discussion about machine learning. So this is the influence of ChatGPT. How can we use more AI in our apps? Also, how can we write code with AI? Unfortunately, they didn't release any developer tools, but usually Apple doesn't react so fast. Then I went ahead and had a look, because my main question was what you actually can do with AI in your apps. It's probably a good idea to just sprinkle in features that make sense, because it also helps with your selling it to your customers of, oh yeah, you're actually having AI tools now. I'm just going to show you a couple of things. There is maybe 2 new talks for CoreML, so machine learning. One of the use cases, I guess, this is the typical one of classification for images. What they added now is, instead of saying, oh, this is an image, of just having one label, saying, oh yeah, this is a cat or this is a dog image, you can now have multiple labels. So for example, here they said, or is this actually an aloe? With 90% probability it is. But you can also add, is this in the kitchen or not? Or with the dog image, does the dog have a toy in his mouth, or has it food, or is he in the park or at home? So you can add more information from this. I'm not really sure if image classifications are such a big deal. Maybe more interesting all these text-based AI possibilities. The one example they had was, for example, you have an app, the user has to work with messages and they want to categorize them. And for example, here they actually had to train the model. And they used 3 categories: commercial, business, and personal. And in this example, this example is visit our site to make a payment. And the AI said is 90% confident this is a commercial message, which I guess you agree. So you can add what type of messages would my user want to categorize to easier find. Maybe priority. You can also do sentiment analysis of saying, oh, is this a positive message or a negative? How urgent is this message? How urgent do I need to react with this kind of stuff? And the cool thing about this update this year is that this is multilingual. This works for multiple languages. And you only need to train it in one language. So they only trained it in English. And then out of the box, it will also work for other languages. I think it was 26 languages. This is quite interesting for developers because now you don't need to deal with all of these different languages. You just do it once. This is the first cool example they had. And then I found there was another talk from 2022. This is about text embeddings. And this is the example where you have an FAQ section. And the user can type, instead of just scrolling through all of the FAQs, you want to find the question that is most related to what the user asked. So here they ask, how do I use it? And the question that is returned, how does it work? And this is quite close from the question. It's just a different way of formulating it. You can also extend this to text-based search, so searching for large documents, like a PDF search feature, finding the information. It will return you the text that is most relevant to your question. If you then would want to do something like HTTP with PDF talking, you could then use first the on-device machine learning to find the text embedding and the search feature, to find the passage, the paragraph that is most relevant to your search. And then you can feed this to OpenAI APIs and say, okay, generate me a nicely formatted response, which would allow you to create a chatbot for your app. And you would only need to give it a document file with all the information on how your app works. You can also download this regularly. You can also get this from your server. And then easily create your own chatbot in the app together with OpenAI or another model. Then the other example was extracting parts of information from the text. So this is an example where they had a food delivery app, and where the user can type in anything like, what sushi restaurants do you deliver from in Cupertino? And what you see here is a word tag. So basically, when you extract information, you say, okay, I don't really care about what do you deliver. I want to know what the food is they're looking for, because then I can say, this is a category, a tag of food. Okay, I can go in my database and say, search for restaurants related to food, sushi. And the other information here is Cupertino. So this is from city. In contrast to, when you say, do you deliver to this city, or is the restaurant in the city? So this is a little bit different. The location of the restaurant, you would search differently in your database. This kind of system, you need to, again, train a model to say, okay, I want to extract this information from the user search inquiries. And then an example use case is the user asks, do you deliver to Cupertino? With AI, you then extract, it's the to Cupertino, so it's a delivery destination. Then you go in your database, find the information of what do we have to delivery in this location. You can then feed this question to OpenAI to say, okay, this is the user question, this is the information we have, now generate a response, or some other way of doing this. The reason why I thought this was quite cool is I had recently an idea where if you had a chatbot in your app where you can just say, okay, open a new document where it does everything in your app, like create me a new document with the name, rename this and this. And then automatically you extract the informations, like rename or new folders, and then you perform the action depending on these tags. So you would not need to explain the user of you need to go there, you need to click there. You could automatically do this. On the other hand, you can also use a chatbot of extracting the information, and then with the tip kit. So this was showing this little tips here to help the user understand your app. You could say, or you have a help bot. You extract the tags and the information, and then from this, you then programmatically open these tips and say, okay, for example, user, how do I create a new document? And then you extract the information, and then you add this tip to the button that creates this document. I think there's quite a lot of possibilities with how to improve your app experience with AI. It's more a question of finding creative ways of actually making a valuable feature and not just adding AI for the sake of adding AI. For me, learning a little bit about this technology is definitely on the list for the next year. We'll see how much time I have. Simply because the topic is so vast. I hope you enjoyed this more extensive walkthrough. Hopefully you saw some cool features that you can use in your own apps as soon as iOS 17 is available. Make sure you subscribe to my channel to not miss any of the in-detail walkthroughs of these new APIs. Like this video if you found it helpful. Until next time, happy coding!